Kate, welcome to Viral History. Thank you so much for chatting to us today. You're going to be talking to us about your new book, Rival Queens, which discusses the relationship between Mary Queen of Scots and Elizabeth I. So can you tell me, first of all, what drew you to the lives of these two women?
I'm fascinated by the idea that there are two queens in one island, both of them surrounded by men who want their power, who are trying to try and take it. And I'm really interested in Mary so often is seen as a failure or a tragic queen, but actually when we look at her, so much of what she did was very similar to what Elizabeth did. She created these networks of loyalty. She had a government that was both Protestant and Catholic. She tried to introduce religious toleration. The big difference between the two of them, of course, is that Mary thought that her husband would solve all her problems, whereas Elizabeth stayed clear of the husband question and was the Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. But I do think that they both should be looked at again in terms of queenship, and their relationship throws a lot of new light on Elizabeth and a lot of new light on Mary as well. And it's just such a fascinating relationship. I do think it's the biggest unrequited love story in history, and that's Mary to Elizabeth. Mary's always begging Elizabeth to see her, to speak to her, to treat her like a cousin, to treat her like a sister, and to Elizabeth, Mary is a sort of annoying little house sprite pulling at her gown. We're often told you're Mary or Elizabeth, you can be one, you're only a Mary girl or Elizabeth girl. What I wanted to show was that you can be both. Because obviously I think the idea is that if you're an Elizabeth girl, you think that Mary was foolish and stupid and undermined queenship and came very close to trying to topple Elizabeth off her throne, which was the ultimate betrayal. But if you're an Elizabeth girl, you think Mary suffered very badly, was treated very badly. She tried to come into England as a queen, and yet Elizabeth increasingly put her under an inquiry which had no verdict, and Mary was in the suspended state of animation. So what I wanted to do in the book is to say that's too simple. We want to look at both sides of the story, and we want to explore both sides of it and see really how both of them were stymied by circumstance in so many ways, most of all by being a queen. And Elizabeth really is the most reluctant person pretty much in the whole of England about executing Mary Queen of Scots. She really doesn't want to do it. Her ministers want to do it. William Cecil's been trying to get her to do it for years. Walsingham to the Parliament. Everyone wants her to execute Mary Queen of Scots, apart from Elizabeth herself. And that's because she knows that if you execute a queen, then what makes them a queen anymore? What makes them royal anymore? And to her, it could possibly undermine monarchy and undermine the queen, which of course it does. It does make it more part of the precedent to then execute Charles I just a few generations down the line. It was initially a very marvellous house arrest. 32 courses at dinner, carts and carts of Mary's belongings, the cloth of state. It was a wonderful imprisonment, but it was an imprisonment for 19 years of Mary. Initially, Mary's conduct being investigated, about the death of her husband, Lord Darnley. The decree made that it was no verdict. And then after that, Mary just continues in this state of suspense, really, and it isn't, but they keep wanting to try and get rid of her, but she doesn't give them the evidence for it. There are these plots that she ignores. There's no evidence that she really is conspiring against Elizabeth until the Babington plot letter, which she's written to, and finally she says, yes, let's depose Elizabeth, let's have an invasion, let's have Philip of Spain come in and bomb with the Catholics here and invade. And she finally agrees to that. Many of us would say, what choice does she have? She's by then under such straight and miserable circumstances. She can't get out. Her son's not going to rescue her. There's just no choice for her. But then she's exposed. Elizabeth knows about it, and there's no alternative but to put her on trial for treason and chop off her head.
So I wonder if you'd heard actually that Tracy Borman once described Mary Queen of Scots as, I think it was the most pointless person in history. Clearly, you don't agree with that.
No, I think that she's a very successful queen in the beginning. Yes, they constantly try and undermine her and steal power from her, but she fights back. And it really isn't until Darnley's murder that things start to go very wrong for her. So she is initially an effective queen. She does come back from France and take power, and the men around her want to be a figurehead, and she wants to be a real monarch herself. And I think she does reveal a lot about the question of queenship, she hadn't really had Elizabeth's childhood, in which Elizabeth saw over and over again how awful marriage could be. Elizabeth's mother executed, Elizabeth's stepmother, Catherine Howard, executed, Elizabeth's stepmother, Catherine Parr, nearly executed. Then Elizabeth had Thomas Seymour, who was essentially a stepfather, grooming her. You see Elizabeth really thinking marriage is not a good idea, and her stepmother eventually dying in childbirth. Whereas Mary had a very happy marriage with Francis in France, and then he died when she was 18. She really did think that a man could solve all of her problems, and that was the thing. Mary married, Elizabeth did not. Elizabeth was powerful and strong and great. Mary was undermined by husbands. They tried to steal power from her. She did choose badly with Darnley and Bothwell, but then Mary did produce a child, and that child became the monarch after Elizabeth I. So that is the real problem for a queen. All monarchs are supposed to marry and reproduce. They always are. And Elizabeth could see it was more trouble than it was worth, that very much like Mary, you're in this complicated position if you're a monarch. You have a son, that's great. But people might start to depose you for your son, because even though your son has no teeth, can't even sit up, he is superior to you because he's a man.
So the upcoming film, all about Mary Queen of Scots and her relationship with Elizabeth I, has sort of dragged up that old debate about filmmakers and them taking liberties perhaps with the truth of historical events. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
I can't wait to see it. Very excited about it, and it's obviously marvellous when you've written a book to watch the film, because when you write a book, even if you write a non-fiction book, I do have a cinematic vision sometimes. That's your imaginative vision, and so it's interesting to see how someone else interprets it. I found this very much when I wrote in Elizabeth II, and then I watched The Crown, in the way in which they did the coronation, moving between the BBC and Westminster Abbey, was so brilliantly done, and I just thought I would never have had the imagination and the vision to create that. So I do think we can learn a lot from filmmakers and what they do. And I do teach a course on this at the university, about talking about why something might get altered, why something might get changed, why. And this is not just about historical films, but also in modern films that are about a modern person, that their life might get altered. And I do think that the thing is about, in a book, you can write for 300, 400 pages and really go into the detail of it, even though I had to cut a lot. But in a film, it has to be much quicker. It has to be 90 minutes, and often, and it's quite, you sometimes have to compress and skip over things. And I think that's a part of filmmaking. Both of my books, Josephine and Emma Hamilton, are getting quite far along the lines of being made into a movie. And so I see that, a movie is a different thing to a book, I think.
From what I've seen of the film's trailer, it looks like Mary Queen of Scots and Elizabeth I do actually meet in the film, which of course didn't happen in real life. So I just wondered, in your opinion, is it okay that is part of the film?
It never happened. Mary was always desperate for meeting, always desperate to meet Elizabeth, frantic for it. But, I obviously haven't seen the movie, but what I interesting about the movie was they make it, I think, from what I can see, is a very private meeting, just the two of them. But in a sense, so Mary still doesn't get what she wants. Mary doesn't want necessarily a small meeting, she wants a big meeting. And I did make actually a big mistake about this in my book. I said that you can't just have a meeting of two queens just together, it has to be something big, like the Field of the Cloth of Gold, with banquets and jousting and all the rest of it. And I said in my book, actually, two queens can't just meet up to drink tea together. And then I was reading it before I submitted it, and I thought, oh, there's no tea in the 16th century. That's a big mistake. So I changed it to a bit of light embroidery. So it's an interesting question. I'm dying to see what the film does with it, because Mary wants this big public meeting because she feels that they'll fall in each other's bosoms, they'll exonerate each other. Mary, when she's having problems in Scotland, flees into England in the hope that Elizabeth's going to put her back on the throne, and she goes into England as a guest, and then she is imprisoned, and she's always hopeful that Elizabeth will help her, and they do. A meeting is mooted in when Mary just arrives on the throne, but Elizabeth cancels it. Mary's obsessed with Elizabeth, completely obsessed, and she's the big focus of her life, but Elizabeth had many other focuses in her life. I mean, the amount of time that Elizabeth sees her potential suitors and Mary is really, but hardly ever happens. People do communicate much more in letters. They are much more. So Mary and Elizabeth do have this relationship. They do have this communication. It's just through letters. In a way, now we would find we meet, not write letters.
And do you believe that had Mary Queen of Scots had that meeting with Elizabeth that she'd wanted for all those years, whether it would have changed her story at all?
I think Mary invested too much hope in it. I think that Elizabeth couldn't do as much for Mary as she always thought. Elizabeth was sympathetic. She was very sympathetic to the idea of Mary getting back onto the throne. But Cecil and the ministers around her were very against the English invading to put Mary back on the throne. They felt that it would be a difficult battle, it could be wasteful, it could be unpopular, and also the government without Mary was Protestant friendly, was England friendly. Many of them had been in the pay of Cecil in the past, and so they were very anti it. So that there wasn't, although Elizabeth was sympathetic, there was really only so much that she could do, because she never saw, although we often see Elizabeth, well, we see her as Gloriana, this great powerful woman, she very much, as Helen Castor has written about so brilliantly in her book about Elizabeth I's study of insecurity, she felt very insecure. She was constantly threatened. There were all these threats from Catholic Europe towards her. She felt she could be pushed off the throne at any minute. So that was her focus, hanging on to her own legitimacy, because Mary Queen of Scots was very legitimately the queen. She was the daughter of the king. He had not divorced his wife. He certainly, but Elizabeth's legitimacy was much more contested, and her position was that demoted from princess to Elizabeth, princess to lady. So you can really see that's her focus and that's her emphasis, whereas to Mary, all she wants is to be her best friend. So, I mean, a meeting early on might have changed Elizabeth to say, okay, Mary's not guilty. This evidence of her killing her husband is very flimsy. I mean, it simply was. Whether, I don't believe that Mary did do it, but even if she did do it, the evidence is hopeless. But I think that's what Elizabeth was scared of as well, because Mary was famously a brilliant charmer. The Duke of Norfolk, who was in charge of the inquiry into her conduct, fell desperately in love with her. Lots of people who'd imprisoned her fell desperately in love with her. She was very charming, very brilliant, very charismatic, very friendly. And I do think Elizabeth feared that if they met up, that she would be suffused with even more sympathy for her than she had at the time.
Well, we can't wait to read your book, and thank you so much for talking to us today. It's been brilliant.
Thank you so much for having me, Gemma. It's been fantastic to be a part of Viral History and everything you do, so I'm thrilled to be here.